Hey guys, welcome to the I Hope They Hear This podcast. Today we have a brand new guest, and we actually met very recently. It wasn't even in person because of the pandemic, but we met through the KAC's one of the professional networking nights. And for those of you who've been listening for a while, if you remember, I want to say several months, maybe even half a year back, we had a guest named Hannah and Eric on. They were KAC board members, and today we have Mrs. Jung Wook Lee. Hello.
Hey David, how are you?
I'm great. And correct me if I'm wrong, but you are also a KC board member, right?
Yes, that's true.
Yeah. Can you just, for people who don't know, who forgot the episodes, can you just explain what KC is and what you do?
Sure. So KAC stands for Korean American Coalition, and it's a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization, and we strive to engage our community on civic engagement and also empower our community through voter registration, naturalization, and just workshops to be self-aware
Mm,
of what our community is going through and what we need to sort of harness our power into action. So
mm,
I've been kind of involved with KAC since 2006. It's a national organization and we have chapters all over the United States. And it was initially started in LA back in 1983, but really got their prominence when LA riots happened.
mm,
So that's when like they realized, okay, we need English speaking community leaders to advocate for our community's interests
mm,
because African Americans had their leaders, obviously white Caucasian Americans, they had their leaders speaking out. But I think Koreans, if I don't know if you've seen any of those like I don't know, short clips about LA riots, you only see Koreans kind of protesting or the store owners kind of like brandishing their guns, right?
mhm,
Or people who are devastated by the fires or destruction of their businesses. So I think, it started when it really called for the community to sort of like stand up and sort of represent our community. So it got really sort of rise up to their prominence then. And
mm.
we've been trying ever since to sort of raise our awareness in each community that we live in. So I've been part of KAC for a while, and I encourage you guys to check it out. It's KACAtlanta.org, or just Google KAC Atlanta, and we have Facebook and website that you could
Yeah.
check us out.
And most recently, one of the campaigns that I kind of highlighted on my podcast was the census, right?
Yes.
Trying to get the Korean American population pretty much on the map for the government to be able to know and understand that we are here and that our interests would be looked after, right?
Sure, sure. So it's trillions of national funding. And also, I was surprised to see how the Korean government was very sort of active in wanting to find out exactly how many Korean nationals also live here, right? So,
Oh, wow.
on, yeah, so, they have to sort of disseminate their resources, right? As a Korean national, if you're a green heart card holder, you're still Korean national in the view of South Korea. So, they have a consulate office here that represents, I think, the Southeast, but obviously from Korean government. Actually, I was involved in one of the workshops that the Korean consulate and the Jewish American young professionals held, and the Korean consulate said that the Georgia economic sort of development is like one of the top three in the nation in terms of Korean American economic development in the Southeast compared to the entire nation of the United States. So we know for a
Wow.
fact that there are a lot of Koreans from Korea moving in and also within United States, Korean Americans moving here into the Southeast. So
Mm,
yeah, it's definitely a growing population, and also with the blue wave of the recent elections and the national spotlight on the Senate race,
right.
Korean American vote or Korean or Asian American population, and like the political sort of power that is emerging is definitely not to be taken lightly.
Mm, yeah. That's really interesting. So is the idea that Because when I think of Korean American immigration to the States, I actually think mostly LA or like New York. But is it now kind of shifting where Korean Americans are coming more to Georgia?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I don't know the hard numbers,
Hmm.
right? And I think the consulate general says like maybe Atlanta is number 5 or 6 in terms of Korean American population in the US, but
Hmm.
I don't know. I think definitely the numbers of H Marts and ASI, I'm sure they do their like, market research,
Right.
right? Like how many radius per population they think that they will cater to. But I haven't been anywhere in the US where the size and the number of like Korean markets are like so many in
Mm,
in terms of like mile radius than Atlanta or Metro Atlanta. So like I would think there is some market, that they're catering to, whether it's like, I don't know, other immigrants or like other Asians. But yeah, I definitely feel like, I've traveled to, I guess, Texas a little bit. I've traveled to Chicago. I've lived in New York, but definitely Korean American population. Maybe compared to LA, it's not as like spread out.
mhm.
Like you could kind of pinpoint where K-Town is from like Buford Highway to Duluth and
Right.
Swanee now, that it seems like there are a lot more Koreans that I encounter compared to other Korean populated cities in the US.
Mm, yeah. And when you mentioned the Rodney King riot, so when my family first immigrated to the US, it was to LA, and it
Oh,
was
wow.
like a few years after the Rodney King riots.
Sure, sure.
So like coming to the States, all of my relatives were like, you have to watch out for Black people. Like
Mm,
I'm sure a lot of that was driven from ignorance, but
sure,
in their minds and their perception, it was Black people don't like Koreans, and that's why
sure,
they did this.
sure.
So yeah, I'm really happy to know that there is an organization like KAC to advocate for Koreans, and even to kind of bridge the gap between fresh immigrants and what the community is, right? Because you guys, I remember during the whole campaign for the census, you guys also did a lot of things in language, right? So in Korean, like how to fill out the census forms and things like that, to help kind of these people. I mean, like my parents' age, people who didn't speak the language, but still needed to engage with the community. And so you guys kind of helped bridge that gap.
So disclaimer, we didn't ourselves like generate that internally, but we
Hmm.
borrowed a lot from Advancing Justice, and also
Mm,
our LA chapter is the only chapter that is staffed with paid staff full time. So they obviously have more resources. So
mm,
we just kind of, because it's a federal programming, like there wasn't anything state specific other than, I don't know, like where the sort of the high density population of Korean Americans lived, but overall general census was a federal sort of mandated counting. So like we just kind of borrowed what other chapters have used or Advancing Justice had, so that we didn't have to reinvent the wheel. But yeah, I
yeah.
mean, our part is like, because it's all volunteer organization, like we want to definitely just sort of like stretch our manpower and our utilize our resources most efficiently as possible. So
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, we don't like, shy away from like borrowing stuff with
Yeah.
permission. Yeah, but
Yeah.
yeah, I think like churches have their own sort of space and where Korean Americans kind of go to get their resources. And I think a lot of times when, Atlanta, I think compared to LA or New York or Chicago, like the immigration history is still very relatively young,
Mm,
right? And we don't have a lot of like nonprofit organizations. But I think KC is uniquely situated that there's some 1.5 like me or second generation folks who are sort of interested, and we do try to bridge the gap between the first generation, like 한인회, and then also like second gen or millennials. Yeah.
mm. Yeah. And just to kind of close the loop on this, how, if someone listening is saying, oh, wow, KC sounds interesting, how would they engage with the organization? What is the easiest way to do so?
Sure. Find us on Facebook. And then we do, we used to have like monthly happy hours a couple of years back, but then we kind of scaled that back. But then, and also due to COVID, we haven't
Yeah.
had that many programming. But, we post all our programming on Facebook, and you could reach us out through that,
Mhm.
or also just Google KAC Metro Atlanta, and then just shoot us an email.
Yeah. And you were mentioning how in Atlanta, especially the Korean American population is relatively young, right? There is just now starting to be kind of like a third generation, right? It's
Sure.
mostly first, second generation. And I think due to that fact, the Korean Americans in Atlanta don't really have a set identity. And this is just to kind of reiterate what I'm trying to do with these stories on this podcast. Let's try to figure out who we are, and let's try to kind of get the word out there of who we are, like kind of our
Sure.
unique struggles and our stories. So with that said, Jungwook, if you wouldn't mind kind of walking us through your story, because you mentioned your 1.5 generation, kind of, so that means that you came here you weren't born here,
Right.
right? So kind of, can you walk us through how you and your family ended up in the States? What were the circumstances that brought you here, and kind of how you navigated growing up and what you're doing now?
Okay. So I was gonna say, David, that there's no like you hit the jackpot in terms of like finding the formula that works, because who doesn't like to talk about themselves, right? So yeah, I mean, I guess you're the Korean male version of Oprah. Yeah, so yeah, I think I listened to your podcast, and I reached out. But yeah, one of the things that I really loved about how you approach it is because, it's very non-threatening,
Mm.
neutral kind of way, like, yeah, just tell me about yourself, right? So everyone is to a certain extent kind of self-absorbed. So like, yeah, what a great way to get things started. But yeah, I came here with my family, my parents, my older brother, who is 3 years older than me, back in 1986. So, not to date myself, I was 10 when I first came here, and we settled in New York, in the Bronx.
Mm.
So, because that's where my mom's parents, my grandparents were there, and also my mom's side of the family. So, I don't know the history of my grandparents when they immigrated to the US, but they actually went through Brazil,
Mm.
and like somehow ended up in the US. But then my mom's older sister's husband worked for Korean Air, I guess back in the 70s or 80s. And then like he somehow, managed to immigrate to the US. And then my grandfather came here, I think illegally through Brazil. And then he
Interesting.
invited his children. And my mom was married back in Korea, but then he petitioned for us when he, I think, was able to petition. So we came here, I guess what Trump will call like chain migration.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that's how it started.
Mm.
And we settled in New York because, all my mom's family were there, my grandparents were there. So, but it wasn't very smooth sailing because, my dad was teaching in high school in Korea, and he wasn't like math or like whatever very those typical subjects, but he taught Korean. I don't know if that's still referred to it as that, but it's
Mhm.
like a prepared military preparedness, right? Because there's a
Interesting.
mandatory, conscription in Korea for
Mhm.
all Korean males. So my dad didn't go to college, but then because his family was so poor, but he kind of joined the military and rise up to the ranks, and then somehow he settled in to getting a job in a high school, teaching the, I guess, male students about military preparedness, and then also female students too, for like first aid kid or whatever. And then so he was doing that, and then my mom was a stay-at-home mother, stay-at-home wife. And then when they came here, like they had no like sort of like business experience whatsoever. So my aunts they had some like one of those like what is it, sewing company, right, that did textile. I think that was pretty big in the 80s in the
Hmm.
East Coast and also West Coast. And then like they didn't have any experience, but they were just kind of forced to get work at those kind of jobs. But then it didn't last long because like they were in mid 30s, and to sort of catch upon that kind of very specialized skill, it was too much for them to get good
Mm.
at it. And then I guess they just didn't like it. So like they started their just, businesses on their own, but they just never had very much luck, you know? So
Mm.
then I realized, okay, in order to become successful in the US, a lot of people say like, oh, America is a land of opportunity,
Right.
and if you work hard, then you'll succeed. But well, working hard in itself like doesn't really lead you to anything, and it's not guaranteed, like unless you have some luck
Mm.
along with it, But I guess my parents just never had any luck in terms of businesses. We had like shoe repair shop that just kind of burned to the ground.
Like literally?
Yeah, literally. Yeah, literally. And they didn't have any insurance coverage
Uh,
on that.
mhm.
But I could go into that a little bit more in detail. But yeah, we had like gift shop. My mom had a nail salon. We had like a grocery store in New
Mhm.
York that was like robbed, and my dad was pistol whipped.
Oh my
So
gosh.
yeah, so they just went through like horrible um yeah, like sort of like like financial, I don't know, ruins,
Mm.
right? In terms of opportunities that they felt like, America was paved with like gold. Everywhere you look is like opportunities. And I don't know, they thought maybe like they'll become the next millionaire
Yeah.
just coming here, but it just, the reality and the dream didn't really match.
Like as I'm listening, I'm realizing that some of the things that you went through, I think there is some common ground for a lot of other Korean American immigrants. Like one thing,
Sure.
first, I think a lot of people my age and younger might not realize is when Korean Americans first immigrated, it was through like family, right?
Mm-hmm.
It was there was a I guess the idea was that if you're here and if you've successfully immigrated, then the type of people that we want to come is also people like you because
Mm-hmm.
you've shown us that you can do it. So if you had family, it was a lot easier to get visas, green cards to come to the States. So for a lot of people whose parents immigrated here, it was because they had relatives or some sort of connection that they were able to come here, right?
Sure, sure.
Um, but yeah, I don't know if a lot of people know that, but also the fact that because we came here, a lot of our parents' age came here without, like set careers. Like they had to do a lot of small businesses, right? So a lot of times they had a lot of cash on hand because the nature of the business was cash. So there, I think a lot of people I talked to, their parents were robbed or were
Mm.
attacked because there was this kind of stereotype that Asian Americans are small business owners and they get targeted. I think that's something that happens even now.
Sure, sure.
Something I think like last year I heard about someone who they own a business downtown.
Yeah.
They came back home in the suburbs and someone had followed them the whole time and they got robbed when they went to work the next day. So
Yeah, I mean, there are strings of armed robberies or burglaries that were targeting Asian Americans, I think last year, like in
mm,
Gwinnett County or what have you in the suburbs. So I think that is either an inside job or I don't know. But
yeah.
yeah, definitely like one of my mentors, like he did say like, oh yeah, when you have a lot of cash, then there's a lot of trouble that follows that cash.
Yeah.
And I think that's really true.
Yeah.
So either someone that knows that you have it or people who just kind of stake out because they know that you deal heavily in cash. So yeah, I mean, I think that goes with the territory,
Mm.
right? Being sort of part of the underbelly of the economy, people are dealing with cash. So I wonder though, like as we transition from cashless like kind of economy. Like I would think that there still be some semblance of cash like in the future, even if
Yeah.
we go all digital, right? But yeah, I wonder if like the likelihood of sort of workplace violence or small business violence would be limited in the future. But
Mm.
yeah, that I don't know.
No, I actually think that because of the types of businesses Korean Americans tend to be in, that we'll be the last ones to transition away from cash. So
Sure.
I actually think it's gonna put an even bigger target on us, like,
Mm,
or because there no one else is gonna have cash. Robbers are gonna kind of specifically target. I know these people still deal with cash, so let's get after
yeah.
them.
Yeah.
Uh,
But you know, I mean, if the consumers are not using cash, then by default, I think business will have no choice but to transition. So
yeah.
I think a lot of businesses now like are probably half and half,
Mhm.
right? Or maybe the trend towards like just credit cards would be like 70-30 credit cards to 30% cash or something like that. So I
Yeah.
think it will be driven by like how the consumers prefer to pay for it. But as you go into economies or sort of society in terms of like lower class communities where banking system is not that widely utilized, then obviously those customers will prefer cash versus like paying with credit card, whatever. So
Mhm.
if you're catering to businesses where the consumers don't carry only carry cash, then obviously your business will stick to that model.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
so hopefully it gets better. But so you, as a very young child, had to kind of witness a lot of these like negative things happening to your parents, right?
Yeah, so it was kind of very traumatic, and I
Yeah.
think I kind of internalized it a lot.
Mm.
And then, I don't know. I think so that's why like my brother and I, like we were really good kids. Like we didn't get into trouble. Like
Mm.
we did everything we're supposed to do because we saw how our parents were just really struggling. So the last business that they had was so after there was an armed robbery, that was a junior year in my high school, right? So we lived in we still lived in the Bronx, but I actually went to school in White Plains, which is like a suburb of like a more wealthier kind of neighborhood.
Mhm.
So my dad, like he was shooken up pretty badly,
Yeah.
and the cops weren't really, trying to find the perpetrator. So and then I don't think we owned that grocery store. So I think it was some sort of a lease and they just did a management for a couple of years. And then the original owners, they wanted it back. So my
Mm.
parents decided to move from like New York to North Carolina.
Mm.
So that was senior year in high school, and they ended up buying out of like out of everything or anything they could have purchased, they ended up buying this southern like buffet style restaurant.
Mm.
And I think that was probably the hardest sort of business for my parents to undertake
Oh,
because,
wow.
I mean, literally, like from my graduating class in New York was like maybe 350 kids to it went down to 125. You imagine like
Mm.
what the scale of like the school, and then like everyone didn't locked their doors. And I mean, it was a very, very small town. And there was actually a Confederate flag painted on the football, like kind of stadium.
Wow.
And I didn't know what that was.
Yeah.
Yeah, because like living from New York, going to North Carolina, like I really didn't know the South at all.
Mm.
And like I thought iced tea was just the Lipton that came in a can, right? And then I had no idea what grits were.
Uh,
And I'm like, wow, this is so different for me, you
yeah.
know? But then I imagine like how difficult my parents had it because
Mm.
they had to learn all these like chicken and dumplings, Salisbury steak and macaroni and cheese, all these like dishes that they've
Yeah.
never tasted in their lives, right? And then they're kind of thrusted upon like this huge learning curve and they
Mm.
had to conduct a business. And it's like for me, I was like, oh, it was difficult decision or difficult transition because I was going into senior year in high school. But my parents like that really didn't even enter into their mind because they had to adjust for themselves to survive.
Yeah.
And like I don't think it just registered in their mind like, oh, this would be a like senior year in high school for our daughter, and she needs to stay in the same school so that she'll transition into college. But no, never mind. It's like, okay, we're just gonna go because in order for us to survive, we need to do something. And the reason why we ended up going to North Carolina was because like they met this random Korean family. And then they're like, yeah, there's a restaurant that's for sale and you guys should come down and live. And like they made that decision to just, just pack everything and
Mm.
go. So I don't know, even now, like I've never really sat down and asked my parents, like, what were you thinking, right? I mean, it was just kind of very random,
Yeah.
but yeah, that was pretty difficult, pretty difficult. And then,
Well,
like,
can I ask
sure.
you, because you said you moved here when you were 10.
Mm-hmm.
So I moved to LA when I was 6, and I
Okay.
have an older brother who's 2 years older than me. And I took to the language pretty quickly because, I mean, going into kindergarten, I think I was like at that ripe age. But for a second grader who's already been through kind of a part of grade school in Korea, I know that it was much more difficult for my brother at 8. And 10 sounds very young, but that's like fourth grade. So,
Sure.
I mean, was it a challenge for you to pick up English? Because obviously, right now you're completely fluent, and I'm honestly kind of surprised by that. But yeah, how was kind of that crossing that language barrier like for you?
I guess I was smart. I'm just kidding.
There you go.
I mean, female, they say like on average, their language skills are much better than males, right?
Mm,
So I think my brother, like being 13, like had more difficult time. And even now, I think he prefers to speak Korean. And
mm,
then also like he, kind of speaks with my mom in Korean and takes care of my mom, so I think he prefers it. But then like for me, I think I came at that cusp where,
mm,
it's a like it was old enough that I would retain some Korean
hmm.
and then young enough that I would pick up a brand new language. So
Okay.
one of the things actually, that was good was because in New York, because there are a lot of immigrants, right? And we lived in the Bronx, there was actually a ESL teacher that was Korean.
Mm,
Yeah, but he really didn't teach us anything. I think he just gave us like written exercise, like subject verb agreement, like
right.
exercises. And like I just remember just going through the hoops and just trying to survive. And I just remember when, so my brother, he went to junior high school and then middle school in New York when we first came. And then like he got beat up by Korean gangs like from his school. So my mom was like so traumatized. She's like, no,
No.
no, no, we're not, gonna send you to back to that school district. So we ended up going to White Plains where
Wow.
my dad purchased the shoe repair shop. But then after it burned down,
Mm,
we moved back to the Bronx. But then we still had to go to the same school in White Plains because for us to go to a school in the Bronx where our district was, it was just too dangerous.
wow.
So I remember just spending a lot of time, I think, in the local library. Like I just read a lot of, I don't know, like young adult fiction.
Mm,
So yeah, I mean, I do remember struggling. I remember being in ESL classes. I remember the Korean American kids my grade kind of not playing with me because I couldn't speak English. But then we went to a school district where there weren't that many Korean American students, period. So I
mm,
think I just ended up by default, trying to befriend some of the regular American kids. And then for some reason, I ended up going to like joining the debate club and then
Oh.
just kind of, I guess, learn my speaking skills then. But yeah, I mean, English didn't come like that easily to me.
Mm.
And then like literally only word that I knew before coming to the US was egg because we had those like A to Z alphabet poster
Uh-huh.
in our living room in Korea. And I guess like my parents wanted us to at least know the alphabet before coming to the US, but then I couldn't get behind letter E. And then for some reason, egg looked like so just kind of bizarre, but it was short enough for me to like plant it in my head, like, okay, that's
Mm.
the only word that I know. And then like the first sentence that I learned how to say was, can I please have one strawberry ice cream cone?
Wow.
Yeah,
It, it's
but
so it's so interesting, like some of the specific things that we remember.
mm-hmm.
Um, oh, that's so funny.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but I mean, I was an English major in college, right? But
Mm.
still, like in high school, I remember whenever I had my papers back, like it would just bleed with like red marks because
Uh,
all my, just like grammar wasn't that great, So yeah, I mean, still for me, like I still feel like I'm learning,
hmm.
and I feel like out of listening, speaking, writing, reading, like writing is probably my weakest sort of point in terms of language.
Mm.
So I'm still working at it. But
Mm.
yeah, it's funny when people say like, "Oh, you speak English really well." I'm like, "What else, can I like what language do you expect me to, speak?" But
Mm.
yeah, I mean, I do sort of feel badly that like my Korean hasn't retained itself. So I
Mm.
do want to like learn Korean, but I'm just too lazy.
Yeah. Okay, then I was gonna ask you a question. I think I know the answer though. But when you think, which language do you think in?
Oh, of course, English.
Okay, okay, gotcha.
It's dominant,
Mm,
dominant. Yeah, yeah,
okay.
yeah.
That's really interesting to me because I know for friends who come like right at that age that you
Mm-hmm.
described, like between
Mm-hmm.
10 and 13, a lot of them end up just really sticking to Korean and having
Mm,
such a difficult time picking up English that
yeah,
they never really fully grasp it. And like some of them even like pray when they pray, they have to pray in Korean because like they
yeah.
can't. Yeah. So that's interesting. So okay, well at least the language part of it wasn't that difficult. It sounds like while you were kind of going through all this craziness, right? So how long did the buffet last in North Carolina?
Yeah, so it didn't last very long because, like it was a very neighborhood kind of business model, and then the owner like lived his entire life in that neighborhood, and he hired his daughter, and all the like employees who were working there were like the neighborhood people, right? That
Mm,
they've knew each other like 30, 40, 50, 60 years even, right? And then you have these brand new, well, like Korean Americans just kind of jumping in. It only lasted for maybe 2 or 3 years. Yeah.
mm.
And then they ended up having to sell it back to the seller, the original owner.
Oh wow.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, that was like really tough because like the breakfast crowd was like the busiest, right?
Hmm.
So people, I mean, and then I guess most people were farmers. And so like a lot of people would come and have breakfast at 6 o'clock in the morning. And of course, like I would go to school during the weekdays, but then I have to work as a waitress on Saturdays and Sundays. And that's when also there were like breakfast crowd was really busy too, because some people would come back from church. But My parents had like very difficult time sort of like handling the American employees. And then like the restaurant business, the profit margin is very slim.
Mm,
So we just like they were just struggling. I mean, so it didn't last very long. And we tried to do some catering businesses, but even then, like, I don't know, like there's some events that they did go, but it wasn't a big money maker at all. So
gotcha.
they really struggled. And then that's when like I had to wake up like 5:30, 5 o'clock in the morning to help out at the restaurant. And
Mm.
then like I would wish like I would pray to God like, oh my God, when I escape this hell, like I want to sleep in as late
Ah,
as I want, and I want to wake up at 11 o'clock or maybe like 1 o'clock, but
mm-hmm.
then once I got to college, like magically my eyes opened up and like at 5 or 6.
Yeah,
So I've been a morning person ever since. Yeah.
gotcha. So
So I
did
guess it's still stuck with me.
so did you go to college in North Carolina then?
Yeah, so I went to college in North Carolina.
I see, I
Yeah,
see. Okay.
yeah.
And then so wait, which college did you go to?
I went to UNC.
Oh, I see, I see. So
Yeah.
while you were going there, so if I'm getting the math correctly, if the restaurant only really lasted 2, 3 years, then does that mean did your parents kind of just move on to a different venture or?
Oh, yeah. So what happened was they befriended this Korean grandma. I think they met at a Korean grocery store or something, and then
Mhm.
they started working for at the Charlotte Douglas Airport as one of
Oh.
those like food vendor cashier type.
Mhm.
So that was the last of them owning a small business.
Oh, okay. So, oh,
So
wow. So small businesses must have left a pretty bad taste in your mouth, right?
yeah, yeah. I mean, so we were talking about yesterday
Yeah.
how like I'm a really like a reluctant small business owner, and growing up like my dad used to be so stressed out, and I don't know. I just I just never saw them like being happy or relaxed, right?
Mm,
Like especially when we had that restaurant, something would break, like the health inspection would come and they would just kind of knock off points for whatever, minor
mm,
infractions that they had, or the refrigerator would break down, or a customer would complain. So I was sort of on the indirect receiving end of that, and I
mm,
was like, okay, I'll never own a small business. I'll just be happy, like getting a paycheck,
mhm,
you know. But then, like we talked about how now I'm a small business person, or I'm an entrepreneur,
mhm,
owning my own business. But yeah, I mean, from just watching my parents struggle and just really never tasting or getting even close to succeeding, that really made a huge impact on me, and said, okay, I'm just gonna be a happy worker and just work for someone, for a government or whatever, and then just
mhm,
collect the paycheck. And that's where my aspirations were. But then I guess the things have weird way of working out. But so yeah, now like I've owned my own law firm for the last, I opened it at 2008. So
wow, 12 years.
13, yeah, 12, 13 years. Yeah. Hmm.
Wow. And for the astute listener, you might have already guessed that our guest is a lawyer, because the two things I was like, oh, that's why she became a lawyer, is you were part of the debate team.
Hmm.
And you did, when you majored in English, did you know you were kind of pre-law already, or?
No, not at all. So my dad had this dream of like me becoming an English professor, and then
Oh.
like going to Korea to become a professor, or like staying in the US and becoming an English professor. So he's like, "Oh yeah, you should, become a professor because, back then or even now, like, being a teacher or being a professor was so highly regarded,
Yeah.
right, in Korea. So I think that was what he wished that I would become. So,
Mm,
like, and I thought about it, but I'm like, oh, there's no way that I could compete with native speakers or all these people with immaculate grammar, and like I have to submit pages and pages of, written projects, and I just can't. So,
mm,
but I mean, I just had fun with the major, like, I love reading, right? Put me in front of words and I'll just sit there hours and hours and end and just
mhm.
staring at the words. But put me in front of some sort of formula or numbers, like I'll just walk away within like 5 minutes because I just can't, my brain doesn't work that way.
Mm,
But interestingly enough, like what I do now, like I do mostly divorce law, is like I look at numbers all the way, all the time.
interesting.
Yeah, because what they fight about is numbers.
Mm, like who gets what, who gets to
Yeah,
keep what.
yeah,
Ah,
yeah.
interesting.
So what's the number? What is the asset division? What is the child support
Mm,
amount going to be? So that's the irony, right? That
mm,
you would think that, oh, as an attorney, like, yeah, if you practice like constitutional law and you have this like legal theory that you're sort of bouncing off, right? But
mhm.
when it comes to the itty-gritty or realities of what domestic law is, at the end of the day, it's just all purely numbers, and you're fighting about like what number is the ultimate sort of settlement that you're getting.
Interesting. So, and I'm really interested in this. I wanted to ask you about the transition from I'm gonna be happy just being like a salaried worker, um, to going to, well, I own my own small business now, right? Because it seems very counterintuitive based on some of the traumas and some of the experiences you have. So, can you
Yeah,
kind of walk
yeah.
us through how that happened?
So like I said, like I wasn't like this entrepreneur when I was 5 or 10, like telling everyone I'm gonna one day like go from my lemonade stand to building a $1 million empire, or like pitching like to Shark Tank, whatever. So that was never my plan, right? But
Hmm.
I think just being an immigrant child and then also having immigrant parents kind of direct me in whatever little ways that they think that they were kind of giving me the guidance. They were like, oh, it's matter of fact that, sooner or later you'll open your own law office. So why not do it now?
Mm,
So they really just kind of pushed me over the fence because I was like, oh, I don't know what I should do after my first law firm just kind of like, I guess, broken up their partnership. So I
mhm,
was in that crossroad, right? Whether should I apply to other law firms or where do I go from here? So I think their Korean mentality, it's like, oh yeah, you just split and you form your own, So for me, it's like knowledge is dangerous. I think I knew barely minimum to feel like, okay, I have a license and I could do this, but then not realizing how dangerous that license or wielding a sword can be if it was kind of used in an inappropriate way,
mm,
or like by omission, like I didn't do what I'm supposed to do. But
mm,
yeah, I mean, I like I said, it was very reluctantly. I was kind of talked into that, but I was young enough and foolish enough to say, "Hey, if someone else could do it, why can't I do it?"
mm,
Kind of thing. But literally, I had like 2 or 3 clients, and then yeah, even now, like my practice is not volume driven. So, I mean, I could have 3, 4 new clients per month and they'll keep me busy.
mm,
So, I mean, my overhead or professional sort of like small businesses like mine, like where the overhead is not that big, and if you could control whether or not you're going to have your own employees, I think it's much more flexible and much more doable, right? And it's not
mm,
as daunting as like, I don't know. I think like opening a dentist office is far more kind of risky, right? Because not only do you need to have all the equipment, there are hundreds of thousands of dollars, but then you also need, assistants, you need front person, you need insurance person. So the model of law firm like is like kind of scaled down kind of vision, and you can make a business out of it, but if you want to keep it small scale, then that's also doable as well.
Wow. So then, because the part that still is kind of surprising to me is the it kind of sounds like it was easy for you to be talked into starting the small business. Like, and was that, would you say that part of that was because it was kind of familiar to you, having witnessed your parents do it? Or like, why wasn't it a bigger hurdle, you think?
I think that subliminal sort of, like what was ingrained in me
Mm,
was definitely there, right? And then I think about like today, I kind of thought about like what I wanted to say, but then also I thought about like just the life journey that I had. Like, I'm a first college graduate in my family.
oh,
My parents, my mom just graduated from junior high, and my dad graduated from high school, and none of their families were very wealthy, right?
mm,
So like every way, like along the way, I kind of needed to figure things out on my own. And and my parents were kind of very different in a way. They were like, oh, just because you are a female or just because you're a daughter, like all you need to carry about is like marrying off really well.
mm,
No, none of that. My
mm,
mom would always say, like, you need to get your, career straight, and then like think about other stuff.
wow.
So she was very, very heavily, kind of lobbying for me to get my education. And like she was the most happiest when I did well in school, and she
Mm,
was very supportive of me going to law school. I mean, my dad too, but they never like said like, oh, you need to get married, like what are you doing pursuing all these things, like, but no, they're very realistic, like it
mm,
doesn't matter, like you need to get your kind of income stream figured out before anything else. And I think also part of it was like I did work my first job out for a law firm, and then they're kind of like, I guess I was kind of unhappy or disgruntled as to how
mm,
there were some differences in terms of male associates and how I was treated. So I was like, okay, like why do I need to kind of work under someone like that or feel like I'm not treated equally or fairly? So I think that was kind of fueling inside me. Probably not as prominent as me trying to figure out like, okay, I need to figure things out on how I could, sort of sustain myself and figure out how I could make a living.
gotcha.
I think that desire just did push me to say, okay, let's just try it out and see what happens.
Oh, wow. So, I mean, there was a lot of kind of encouragement and support from your parents, to set you up to become a small business owner.
I mean, yes and no, right? But I think they were just more like, oh, if you're afraid, there's nothing to be afraid of, even though
Mm,
I've seen their failures, right? But I
yeah.
think from their point of view, it was completely different business model, right? That I wasn't
Mm,
running a restaurant, I'm not running a grocery store, but this is something very niche market, what I'm doing, that there are people who are willing to pay for my services without me having to chase them down to try to convince them that I'm the best,
mm,
or they need to hire me, kind of sense. But I don't know now, like having done it for the last 12, 13 years, like I do see sort of difference in like the business model. I see how people take this differently, right? So it is really what you make of it and what your comfort zone is. And I think for me, like I don't want to make a business out of it, right? I don't need to be on a billboard, on a bus, or on a TV, but then like the marketing is what people are going to see and come to you.
mhm,
So I don't know, it's still a constant struggle for me. It's like how do I scale it in a way that, or how do I sustain it so that right now, if I don't work, I don't have any income, right? But then
Mm.
people who make a business out of it, even they're not working, there's, people who are generating income for them. So
Right.
how do I strike that balance? But I mean, I don't know. For me, like, I just don't want to go big scale because there's still a lot of liability. At the end of the
Mm.
day, it's my signature, it's my bar number that's being signed off on, and I don't want to hire like two or three like paralegals, ultimately have my name on it, but at the end of the day, like it comes back like done incorrectly, like then I
Mm.
have to be responsible for it.
Yeah. And I think
Yeah,
that's a good segue into the next question I wanted to ask is what are some of the pros and cons of owning your own business? Because
sure.
you were working for a law firm before and now you
Mm-hmm.
kind of are your own boss. So
Sure.
yeah, can you give us that?
Definitely I'll start with the con that the buck stops with you, right? You have to ultimately be responsible. If
Hmm.
there's an angry client, you can't just, kind of forward a call to your boss or,
Yeah.
try to have someone else handle it. It's you who has to make the sort of the call and make that difficult conversation, right?
Mm.
If a case ends up, I don't know, working out in a different way or adverse to what your client's interest is, then you have to sort of wear the big boy or big girl pants and then like talk to them.
Mm.
And then, yeah, so I think and then it could be kind of isolating, right? And I don't know if there are some listeners who are interested in becoming a lawyer. I would definitely advise them to go to a law school where they'll end up practicing, right? So I went to law school up in Connecticut and then came here to Georgia, not knowing a single soul. So for me, that was
Mm.
very isolating. And then also becoming like being a woman, I think for men, it's easier for them to just kind of strike up a friendship and open a partnership. But I think for females, it's slightly more complicated or
Mm.
it's harder. So it's been kind of difficult for me, right? And to create that synergy on your own. And sometimes there were days where I'm like in my office just by myself trying to like figure things out. And that was really lonely and isolating
Mm.
and like really stressful. The pros of it is the pure kind of flexibility that you have, right?
Mm.
So, I mean, for me, like just because the hours are flexible, like I still went to work at 9 and came home at 6, like every single day for the first like almost a decade, right? Because
Mm.
I need to be in that structural scheduling and but having that flexibility, like having to just focus on something else, like during the workday or shifting or pivoting your practice area without having to get a permission from someone else, like that was really nice, right?
Mm.
So I think the freedom, that's always a nice sort of advantage. And then like just pure income, right? You don't have to divide it
Yeah.
with anyone else, but then you eat what you kill, right? So
Yeah.
if there are days or there are months where like you're not like, generating income, then you're not generating income. So
Mm.
so you have to be accountable to whatever activities or whatever cases that you're bringing so that you have to sustain yourself financially. So yeah, I mean, but I guess in the end, like for me now I did have an opportunity to like go into a firm or at least get an interview.
Hmm.
But now I'm like, that's just going to be too much caseload work, and even if I make the same amount, I'll be working 3 or 4 times as harder. And there isn't
Mm.
any point where I could actually like fire a client because I don't like dealing with them, right? Because there's a firm telling me that I have to work for that client. And
Mm.
so for me now to sort of imagine myself working for a firm, like that would be very hard pill to swallow after experiencing all this sort of freedom and
Freedom.
flexibility that
Mm.
that I've had. But I'm sure like steady paycheck
Yeah.
is nothing to shabby, but
Yeah.
I'm just kind of comparing the pros and cons. So
Mm.
like I think now I'm just so set in my ways that it would be difficult for me to go and learn and sort of meet their expectations. Yeah.
Right. Well, so does it happen where lawyers kind of like had the desire to fire a client because you didn't like working with them?
Oh yeah. I
Oh.
mean, it doesn't happen often,
Hmm.
but yeah, I mean, yeah, I've had it just maybe a handful of times,
Hmm.
even then. Yeah, cause that, and then like because they kind of project like their nervousness, their insecurities and onto you. And
Hmm.
I think at the end of the day, if I have a client calling me like every other day, say, "Oh, what is the status? Oh, I thought about this, blah blah blah, and I think it could help." Even if I get paid hourly, like I just I don't know, it's telling me that they don't trust my sort of abilities
Mm.
to handle their case in a way that is most sort of uh useful for them, right? For
Mm.
having them to constantly call. So yeah, there were a couple of times where I just told the client like, I don't know if I were like white, I don't know, male attorney, whether you would respond or you would behave the same way. And
Hmm.
I mean, I didn't say that like directly to their face, but like
Right.
in my mind, I'm thinking, okay, are you doing that because I'm a female and I'm Korean and I'm accessible because I actually pick up your phone call rather than your phone call going through a paralegal and then going to an attorney who
Mm.
may not get it or get it, but then like, ah, this is not priority, right? And then don't return your call for like a weeks on end. So being readily accessible, the fact that I'm a female and the fact that I'm kind of young, that you feel like you could do that without having drawn the boundaries. So like there are times when, yeah, I told them like, oh, I don't think it's working out. So it's better that you find someone that you feel more comfortable or you feel like, I don't know, they're more sort of aligned with what your expectations are.
Mm.
So yeah.
Wow, that's huge to be able to do that because as a consultant, I wish I had the ability to drop clients sometimes.
Uh,
But then, I work for a company, so that's not my decision. But I'm
yeah.
sure like even like mental health wise, having that as an option is huge, right?
Yeah, but I mean, like it has to be pretty severe, right?
Mm,
It's
right,
not
because it's
like
revenue.
my go-to sort of like knee-jerk reaction,
Yeah.
first instance of resistance or some sort of like confrontation,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
Because then you have to kind of figure out, okay, I need to figure out how to work around that. So I think
Mm.
when I was younger, I was a little bit more hesitant, right? And there's more leadway that I provided the client, right? Just because I didn't have the experience. But like you said, it crosses the boundary where they really infringe upon your free time and they kind of question your ability as to whether or not you're doing your job, right?
Hmm.
Then it becomes like, I don't know, personal, right?
Right.
So, even though you're paying me hourly, but then there's plenty of other work that I feel like I want to focus my energies on. And I know they're there like in that situation because divorce is also like up there in terms of stress level, same
Yeah.
as like losing a loved one, right?
Yeah.
So I know that mentally it's one of the toughest stages of their lives, and I know that they're going through that, but sometimes like I need to be left alone to do my job. But if you're incessantly just kind of questioning me, and then people will say like, oh, I did talk to some other lawyer and this lawyer said this. I'm like, okay, so you're already getting second opinion, which is
Right.
fine, it's within your rights, but sometimes lawyers tell you what you want to hear, right? And
Mm.
then if you're sort of second guessing what I'm telling you enough that you're consulting with someone else and you like what they're having to tell you, then okay, then it's probably better for you to switch horses, even if it's midstream, because that's what you want to sort of believe. And I don't know, I think there's still a mentality like Jewish white men will do your case far more effectively than Korean American
Yeah.
professionals, which there's some truth to that, but at the same time, I don't know, at what length that stereotype or that mentality holds true.
Mm.
So
Yeah.
yeah.
The thing that I really appreciate about your story, Jungkook, is Yeah, that stereotype exists, I think, for, Asian Americans, but I feel like you're on the front lines of kind of erasing that stereotype, like fighting that stereotype away, right? Because it is really commonplace for the older Korean generation to say things like, "Oh, that person's white; they're gonna do a better job." Like, and I don't know if it's because they had some negative experiences, like whatever it
Sure,
may be,
sure.
but the fact that you're out there kind of fighting that stereotype, I think it's gonna serve the future generations, like the third, fourth, fifth Korean American generations. It's gonna serve them very well.
So
Um,
I would also ask you and also your listeners, like I know my parents' generation, like their peers, seeing them on a professional level, either, like for example, my dad in North Carolina went to the CPA that was like about same age as he, and then like the CPA probably graduated from Korea, like one of those like, renowned university and came to US as an international student, and then like they graduated masters or whatever, and then they opened their own business, and then they had that's how they started, right?
mhm,
So I think my parents definitely felt like, okay, they are more educated than I am, obviously, and they have the whatever the license to practice their trade, and then they kind of went for that. But then there's some stories about like, oh, they made a mistake or they weren't as effective, so that kind of trickled down to me. And then
mm,
sometimes I know I myself have some sort of like stereotype or prejudice against, I guess, first generation professional, right? So given a choice, like if I open a Yellow Pages or Google for whatever professional services that I seek,
mhm,
I don't know if I would pick a Korean American over like an American or other Asian professionals who are younger, than that
mm,
Korean American professional. So yeah, I mean, I think that's something that each one of us will need to kind of do a soul searching. And obviously, if you
yeah.
did receive a referral from your friend, like, oh, this Korean American professional, did a great job. I'm very satisfied. And then you're like, okay, that person, is vetted by my friend who I admire or who I vouch that that person has a good judgment, then you would naturally go to them. But I wonder if you're the person in that decision maker making sort of situation, whether you would prefer a Korean American versus just a white, generic person of the same like professional quality.
Yeah, yeah, and I definitely agree that there has to be a soul search. Like you kind of have to be introspective, ask yourself that question. But not only that though, I think the impact there's like a ripple effect, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
if you hear your parents saying, "I don't trust Korean professionals" all your life, then when you grow up and it's time for you to decide on your career, there might be a remnant in your mind saying, "You're Korean American, you can't do this work," right?
Yeah,
So
yeah,
I think the thing that you're doing is the younger listeners who don't have like a set career yet, now for them, small business owner owner of a law firm is an available option for them, you know.
yeah,
And so I think, yeah, I actually didn't have that growing up. I
sure.
like if you want to be a owner of a law firm, you have to be like a old white guy with a lot of connections and a lot of money. And like I would have never thought like Asian American female could be that. Like I would have never thought that because I was never exposed to that. But
Sure, sure.
yeah, that's why I say like you're on the front lines. You're opening up a new world for these people out here. So no,
Yeah.
I want to thank you for that. I think
Oh,
that's yeah, awesome.
well, I think we all have like our sort of mission in life,
Mhm.
right? Whether you happen to be there by default or by design or whatever, sure coincidence. But yeah, I mean, I would encourage having 80 or 90% of my clients are Koreans. And even then, like I have far more Korean speaking clients compared to Korean Americans who prefer English speaking sort of professional.
Hmm.
But I mean, I do now see demographic shifting where my clients are like kind of younger and we talk in English versus like
Mm,
talking in Korean, right? And
mhm,
they're educated here. So, I mean, that's good in a bad way, but that they're getting divorced, but it's
mm,
just part of life, right? So like it is kind of affirming that they do want to sort of hire Korean American professionals because they do feel like there's cultural connection
mm.
and also there is sufficient competency where they feel like, okay, whether I go to this person or like a white professional, like the end result is going to be the same. And if that's the case, then I would prefer to support a fellow Korean American. I
Yeah,
mean, not to say that that's like a must, but I think like that would sort of definitely kind of carry our profession or our credibility in the community far more and advance our goal of like I guess also competing with other nationality and say, hey, we have people who are equally competent and they could handle these kind of situations, so now we have our own rising among the ranks and why not utilize them, right?
yeah,
So
yeah.
yeah, I think that would be really good.
Yeah, for sure. And I remember my dad he had to get a gallbladder surgery done like 2 or 3 years ago, 1 or 2 years ago. And the surgeon, we didn't know him, but the surgeon that came was a second generation Korean American.
Oh yeah.
And he couldn't speak Korean that well. Like it was very
Mhm.
basic and he was able to explain basic things. But my parents' reaction wasn't, oh no, he's Korean. He's not going to do a good job. It was, oh, he's a Korean guy who was educated in America. Like,
Yeah.
so like there's like a paradigm shift, right? Of going from, oh, Koreans don't do well to now, oh, I'm so glad like someone I have this
Mhm.
commonality with is going to be working on me. So yeah, that I think that's yeah, it's happening around us right now. And
Yeah, I mean definitely like medical providers and dentists. I
mhm.
would go to a Korean like hands down
Uh-huh.
because I know like their workmanship is far superior, right?
Mm,
And like attention to detail. Like I know it's kind of stereotype, but yeah, there are certain professions that I definitely feel like hands down it's far better to go to a Korean American versus like just nondescript kind of regular, kind of professional available. So
yeah.
yeah, maybe, attorneys are also like on that list now, right?
Mm,
Compared to like a decade ago or 20 years ago. So now like I do see a lot more young Korean American attorneys that are not just transactional, but also doing litigation, right?
mm,
Because a lot of first generation Korean American attorneys, they shied away from litigation because their speaking skills were not as great, right?
yeah.
But now we have second gen Korean Americans that are like fighting in the courtroom where your presence and your sort of ability to persuade verbally is superior, or
Mm,
it takes such a precedent and such an importance that now the Koreans will feel like, okay, we don't have to kind of outsource that to someone else, but we have someone, a second generation, who could fight for us without having to feel like they're handicapped.
yeah. Yeah. Oh, well, thank you so much for like walking us through your life today.
Oh, sure.
We're at the hour mark, and I don't want to take up too much of your time, and especially because you're busy. But before we kind of close out, is there any last thoughts that you have? Any things that you wanted to discuss that we didn't get to?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the things that I really like about your podcast is like just people being very genuine and being very frank about whatever aspect of their lives. And I hope that we're not just focusing on like, oh, she's a success story and rags to riches.
Yeah.
By no means, not at all.
Mhm.
I actually wanted to talk a little bit about like some isolation and anxiety attacks
Yeah.
that I've had.
Right.
Um, so we didn't get to that like this time around. But yeah, I mean, we're like none of us are invincible, right?
Mm,
And whatever facade or whatever sort of image of success is portrayed upon, there's equally sort of long shadow, like underneath it, and I mean, we did talk about like just the traumatic experience of my parents sort of like failing in their small businesses and the trauma of like having to see that, witness that. I think that that still is part of me.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, like I hope that, your listeners or your viewers know that I'm not sitting on my laurels by any means, but there are sort of certainly the shortcomings that I've had and my professional challenges that I have as a solo practitioner, that it's not just like, easy walk in the park, but real struggles. So people know that like success is, Koreans are like all about success stories, but um, there isn't a clear cut, like happy endings, like, just one dimensional sort of portrayal of who I am, but then
Hmm.
there's multi-dimensional and struggles and difficulties that I still face. So I hope that they know that, if they want to reach out to me, or if there are some things that they want to talk about, like by all means, like I would love to kind of share my struggles with them, and maybe there will be an opportunity where like I do talk about those things, where it's not just glitter and just like success story, but real deep down like hurt and some sort of difficulties that I'm still experiencing, that your listeners or viewers could relate to, and know that they're not alone.
Yeah, and I think that's really important. Thank you so much for sharing that. We talked about it kind of briefly yesterday when we spoke, but yeah, I mean, obviously because the buck stops at you, there's a lot of anxiety in terms of like how you know the work that you do for your clients and things like that. And yeah, for people out there who think that owning a small business is all glamour, yeah, I really hope that they understand what you're talking about, like all the
Hmm.
struggles and all the hard work that it takes to get to where you are. So yeah, thanks for sharing that.
Sure, sure.
Yeah.
Well, thank you again. And I really love this platform. And I really definitely, it's cool that you have your day job, but then you have something on
Yeah.
the side
Hmm.
that is very genuine, and people are real,
Hmm.
and you're kind of sharing. So I think that's why I really had no hesitation whatsoever reaching out to you, and just kind of subliminally sent you a message like, yeah, I want to be on it.
No, but
So
it worked out well because when I heard your story during the networking night, I really wanted you on as well.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
Yeah, so thank you guys so much for listening. Like Jungwook said, if you have any questions or if you kind of want to reach out to her, you can go through me. You can email me at ihthtpodcast@gmail.com. That's I hope they hear this, abbreviated, or on Instagram at I hope they hear this. And I don't know if I talked about this much, but the YouTube page is still happening. The videos are still being uploaded. So just search I hope they hear this on YouTube and you'll be able to view this in video form as well. And so, yeah, thank you guys for everybody who tuned in. Thank you guys so much for listening. Jung, thank you so much for being on, and we'll
Sure.
talk to you guys next time.
Thank you.